Hi, I'm Richard S. Drake, and you're watching the Caine interviews on Community Access Television in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Channel 18.
Hello, I'm Shannon Caine. On this episode of the Caine Interviews, we'll be talking with Richard S. Drake, a journalist who's written a book on Fayetteville area history, arts, and politics, and the book is entitled Ozark Mosaic, Adventures in Arkansas Alternative Journalism. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shannon. Good to be here.
All right, well, how did you get started in alternative journalism in this area?
I never wanted to be an alternative journalist. I wanted to be a real journalist. But I didn't finish college, so I started writing for the Grapevine, which was a long-running newspaper in the early 1990s. And I was hired on the basis of some letters to the editor I wrote, because I'd been writing letters to the editor for years, and a few sample columns I'd given them. And then they offered me my own column in the Grapevine.
Oh, okay. Now, do you think that the role of a journalist overlaps with the role of historian? What role do journalists play in not only recording regional history, but in actually writing that history?
Well, I get emails from a law professor. I'm on her list, and on the bottom of her emails it goes, journalism is history on the run. And because there's very little written history about Fayetteville, Northwest Arkansas in the 20th century, so the journalists have written most of it. And most of it has been written as quickly as you can. You don't get a chance to just polish everything.
Mm-hmm. Now, is your book part of an attempt to recover a bit of local history that might otherwise have been ignored or glossed over by other media outlets?
If you move to town today, Shannon, or one of your friends moves to town, and goes to the public library and wants to research the history of Fayetteville, no alternative papers are kept on microfilm there. Only daily newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some daily newspapers, especially in the past, which have performed as sort of handmaidens to the Chamber of Commerce. So if you want to get the history of Fayetteville, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, from those newspapers, you would get a very garbled version of history. And if you go to the bookstore and you want books on the history of our area, you're going to get picture books. You're going to get pictures of postcards or photographs, but very little written text. There's very little written history about Fayetteville, especially in the last 70 or 80 years.
Okay. Now, your book covers a rather wide array of topics, including politics, the arts, profiles of local citizens, obituaries, history, editorials. Would you consider these writings to be objective journalism? Some people may claim that your work has a leftist slant. How would you respond to that?
My editorials have a leftist slant, and I don't apologize for that. I mean, my editorials don't have... my editorials are very definitely written from a leftist slant. My news articles, though, were written as straight news. And it's kind of violating a principle of journalism that you'd have an editor writing news articles as well as editorials. So it's sort of schizophrenic on my part when I would do that, but I endeavored to do the best I could to make the news articles as factual as possible without tipping my hand to the reader as to how I felt about an issue. I would do that in the editorials, but not in the news articles.
Okay. Now, some of the major issues in Fayetteville's more recent history have been things like the incinerator issue, cable access funding, tree ordinance, the human dignity resolution, construction of the Walton Arts Center and the town center, and the gentrification of Dixon Street. So I'd kind of like to address some of these topics briefly and assess their impact on local politics. Let's take Dixon Street first. What was it like before gentrification, and do you think that the current sanitized incarnation of Dixon Street has lost a lot of its character?
Dixon Street's character has changed so much over the years. Now there was a part of our history where the Dixon character was sort of sleazy. you know. We had the few famous clubs on Dixon Street where the old joke ran, if they searched you at the door for a gun or a knife, if you didn't have one, they gave you one. You know, it was pretty rough. There's a Peter Fonda movie shot on Dixon Street, which shows a lot of the older Dixon Street, called Fighting Mad, was shot in the 70s. Wow. Brenda's Bigger Burgers was in that too. During the 80s, Dixon Street started to get really run down. And, you know, there was a need to clean up the street to make it safer for people. But unfortunately, what's happened is cold and dispassionate eyes are looking on Dixon Street as a source of income. And so a lot of people have been made to feel unwelcome on Dixon Street as the gentrification has taken place. And so it was a place, Dixon Street represented, for most people in Fayetteville, a place where everybody of every economic stripe and every social strata could get together, like the restaurant on the corner on Dixon Street or anywhere on Dixon Street, and mingle. And now there is not that feeling.
Okay, now, who's behind the Dixon Street gentrification effort anyway? Who's doing this and why?
The Trilateral Commission.
Okay.
No, this I've been waiting to throw that one in. It's hard to say who's behind it. People who want to make money. Okay. I think people who are short-sighted, who don't value the heritage of Dixon Street. And, you know, for crying out loud, Dixon Street's this long. I mean, it's not like Bourbon Street. It's not like the other areas around the country you go to. Dixon Street's what, 3 blocks, 4 blocks? And several years ago, they started calling it the entertainment district. And the newspapers dutifully fell in line with this and started calling Dixon the entertainment district, even though there's no actual proof that people spend most of their entertainment dollar on Dixon Street. But it became known as the entertainment district, so as to make people believe it was. But it's only 4 blocks long, so. Mm-hmm. And but as to who's behind it, I just think that speculators, people see a chance to make money, and I don't think they realize that we don't have the economic base in our area to support that vision for very long.
Okay. Dixon Street gentrification aside, do you think that there's a continuum of Fayetteville's upper class favoring aesthetics over people?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, God, yes. Right. And that's happened for some time. You know, when I first started doing my talk show 13 years ago, it was a call-in show. And one night we were talking about the poorer people in Fayetteville, and one woman called in and said, there are no poor people in Fayetteville, it's a white-collar community. So a lot of people don't see the sort of community they live in. They actually don't see poor people living in their town. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of people are being forgotten or looked over.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the incinerator issue. So there was a proposition at one time that pollution from landfills could be avoided by incinerating trash and subsequently selling the steam to the U of A. Sounds good. What was the problem?
Well, it sounded good. There were several problems. One problem was, and one man in Fayetteville actually started the ball rolling, when he kept asking the question, oh, where does the ash go? And nobody ever had an answer for that. And he kept asking this question, and then more and more people started asking the question. And then there was a non-binding vote, if my memory serves me correctly, in 1988, where the people of Fayetteville said, we do not want an incinerator, because they were going to position this thing in several different parts of town, next to a school, next to Abilities Unlimited, next to several other things. So it was never going to be in a place that was safe to have an incinerator. And then the bonds, we found out we sort of had to pay off the bonds whether we had the incinerator or not. So there was a lawsuit over that. The incinerator is really where Fayetteville sort of came of age politically. And it was a working class movement, primarily to stop the incinerator. That's where most of the leaders came from the working class.
Okay, so it sounds like the incinerator wasn't a well thought out proposal due to too many unanswered questions. But wasn't there something of an unfavorable reaction toward those individuals who actually unmasked those problems and started asking the hard questions?
Yes, and that actually extends to this day. People began being maligned in the daily by people in the city administration of Fayetteville and in the editorial pages of daily newspapers as beginners, as those who were against progress. And in fact, that attitude extended even up until the town center. People who were asking questions about the town center and the viability of it were labeled as somehow being against progress in Fayetteville. And there was also, there was people who were labeled as being part of a group. And the group actually extended. It consisted of factory workers, college professors, business people, retired people, but somehow there was this insidious group that wanted to control events in Fayetteville.
Well, let's move on to the Human Dignity Resolution. In a nutshell, what was it?
The Human Dignity Resolution, quite simply put, was a proposal on the part of one alderman, Randy Zerker, that city employees would not be prejudiced against on the basis of their sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. And that's all it was. And it became blown out of all proportion, and people started, because we're a right-to-work state.
Right. We
have the glory of living in a right-to-work state, which is really, a right-to-starve state.
Yeah.
But people started saying, well, they're going to make us do what we want in our own private, they're going to force us in our own private business, and they're going to make anybody dealing with the city of Fayetteville, we can't be prejudiced against gay people. All it did was protect the jobs of gay employees who worked for the city of Fayetteville.
Okay. Who was against that proposal? I mean,
my real flippant answer is to say bigots, and in some cases, in a lot of cases that was true. Ignorant people, otherwise intelligent people who didn't really study it, who didn't see that it was a good thing. In fact, one of the more shameful things that happened at about this time was the Washington County Quorum Court, which had on its books for 10 years protection for gay employees, decided at that point to withdraw the protection for gay employees. Because it was embarrassing, because none of these dire predictions, if you give gay employees protection, they're going to sue the city, or there's going to be higher medical costs or things like that. None of that ever came to, none of that happened after the county put it in theirs. Job protection. So it's sort of an embarrassment for the county that this had never happened, especially for the more conservative elements. So in a move that was not the Washington County Quorum Court's intellectual or moral finest hour, they removed it. And I kept hoping that someone would sue them, because they had denied a class of people who had heretofore been protected, and suddenly they yanked their civil rights away.
Okay. Do you regard the failure to pass the Human Dignity Resolution as one of the more shameful chapters in Fayetteville's history?
It was a sign that we're not quite as liberal as we think we are.
Right.
People like to think of Fayetteville as the Athens of the Ozarks, but at around that point we started becoming sort of the Sparta of the Ozarks. And it is pretty shameful. What was shameful, I think, is that so many people willfully misinterpreted it. Right. The people who were opposed to it weren't opposed to it on honest grounds. And the people at city council meetings, a favorite question of people when they would get up and speak, they'd ask Randy Zerker, who had sponsored this, they would say, "Are you a Christian, Mr. Zerker?" As if somehow he was in league with Satan. And so it came down on very religious grounds, and it was, in a sense, it was laughable, but in a sense it was very sad.
Yeah, well, but it came down with a lot of religious objection, yet Reverend Lowell Grisham, among others, came out in favor of the Human Dignity Resolution, right?
The Episcopal Church, I think, is which I'm proud to be a member of, is a more liberal church, I think, than many other churches.
Right.
And it wasn't just religious, it was also business, because as I mentioned, we are a right-to-work state. And so people saw it as an encroachment upon the rights of employers. Our Arkansas employees had very few rights to begin with, and we couldn't, start giving them rights now over this issue.
Okay. Well, moving along to the Walton Arts Center and the Town Center, for the sake of time, I'm just going to tackle these together.
Okay.
Because the issues are somewhat similar. So when these structures were being pitched to the city, The Walton Arts Center and the Town Center were each claimed to be for the benefit of the general public. How accessible do you feel each of these structures really is to the public, and not just the moneyed public, but to the entire public?
When in Fayetteville they come to you with a project and they say, this will benefit ordinary people, and Shannon Caine will be able to have an art show here, or average people in Fayetteville will be able to rent this place for a private party or wedding reception. I think it's time to hide your wallet. And those were the arguments that were made to sell us on these projects, was that it was going to be accessible for ordinary people in Fayetteville who had to vote on these projects. And remember Cassandra at the Battle of Troy? Say, don't let that horse in here. Well, there were people saying, no, wait a minute, this is not a good idea because this is not going to happen, because the way things are set up, you're going to have to charge a lot of money and ordinary people are not going to be able to use it. Unfortunately, that argument didn't convince a lot of people, and so they were built. Now, I'm not bashing the Art Center particularly, because I've gone to the Art Center. I like the Walton Art Center. I wish it was more accessible to the average person, to poorer artists, to have art shows. Mm-hmm. And rather than have Miss Saigon, I wish there were more plays put on by local people. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're going after the out-of-town dollar with the Art Center. And the Town Center, which is a really beautiful-looking storage building just off the square. It's true, I was always opposed to the Town Center, and because all across the country, Shannon, in fact, I've even been to Canada and Toronto, where they were begging people to use their convention center, to use their town centers. I've seen it in city after city. Town centers are underused. We're going to be paying for this white elephant for decades to come. And so, no, I mean, and it's there have been some good things held in the town center, like Freedom Fest for CAT and other things, but, you say, well, is it really worth the money? No, when times are tight, I don't think the Art Center or the Town Center are being utilized as fully as they could be, and I don't think they're reaching as many people as they could.
Okay. Now, the very medium on which we're appearing, cable access television, has had no end of difficulty in retaining its funding and support. When you strip away all the other issues, do you think the crux of the problem is that cable access affords an open voice to political dissent and opposition?
Yes. Okay. But I'll elaborate, too. I won't just stick to it, yes. The wrong sort of people use public access all across the country. Poor people, working class people, radicals, liberals, union organizers. Of course, we're also open to the Klan and right-wing people who want to use it. We're open to anybody, but the wrong sort of people. Now, there are jealous eyes who look upon Channel 18, and they would like to see that as part of a regional arts channel. Now, when that argument starts being made later this year, and you hear the phrase, and this arts channel will be for everybody, people should learn from experience and realize that if public access is somehow squashed and we were made into a regional arts channel, which is Channel 18 across the board is reserved, across the county, I think the Jones Center's on most of the other channels, I think people don't realize what they would be losing. And what they would be losing is freedom of speech.
Right. Now, speaking of political dissent, we'll go to the tree issue. Trees were raised to build the Kohl's store despite widespread public outcry. The developers didn't share the protesters' opinion that Fayetteville needed trees more than it needed another store, and a store, in fact, that a lot of people felt was redundant because it carries items already quite available in the Fayetteville area. What was so special about that stand of trees?
The city of Fayetteville violated its own ordinances in allowing Kohl's to build where they did. And that was the crux of the matter. You drive by, I think for the next several years, you're going to drive by Kohl's and see these silly-ass skinny trees sticking up. And that's the extent of their devotion to our tree ordinance. And the city council and the administration of Mayor Hanna allowed the developers to do that, to get away with that, which upset so many people. Hence, it led to the tree sitting incident, and so many people actually protesting outside Kohl's.
And sometimes you can still see the bumper stickers.
Yes, yes,
I
they're still
will
around.
not shop at Kohl's. Kohl's kills trees.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's just look back at some of the issues that we just discussed. Cable access, the incinerator issue, Walton Arts Center, etc. What I want to know is what's the commonality of all the issues? Is there any single underlying theme that unites all these issues despite the seeming differences?
When ordinary people are bypassed in the decision-making process, that's when trouble arises. As I said, the incinerator issue is sort of when the people of Fayetteville came of age politically, because a lot of working class people led the movement to stop the incinerator. And public access is, for better or worse, primarily a working class issue. And it is somehow pitted the working class against maybe some people who view themselves as the elite in some circumstances. So what you're seeing are really very much the working class looking out for the best interests of Fayetteville, who are asking the questions, who are then labeled as beginners or part of a group that's opposed to progress.
Okay. Well, now for something completely different. Tell us about the Tri-City Theater.
Tri-City, I never went there. Tri-City was a porno theater in Springdale, and it was what it was you'd have this little cinder block building right here, and all around the cinder block building were about 50 screens, and they were about the size of, like, say, a doorway. And my understanding was, a former camp manager told me how this worked. They used a prism in the projection booth to send the picture out to all 50 screens at once, and you had to listen to the sound on your AM radio. That was what we would do on a Saturday night. Take some Budweiser and Doritos and go out to Tri-City. It was located in Sonora.
Oh, yeah.
And do you remember Poltergeist?
Yeah.
Well, I have this theory that the people in Sonora are probably the most sexually satisfied people in northwest Arkansas because of all that passion that still exists in the air down there, but I don't think anybody's actually taken a poll to ask them. But Tri-City died a natural death when VCRs came into being. More people, as they became more affordable and people could rent or buy their own porno videos, all of a sudden you noticed there hadn't been an ad for Tri-City in the paper for a long time. And I don't think anybody's able to really pinpoint the death of Tri-City. They just know at some point they stopped noticing the ads.
Okay, well, is the Tri-City Theater another part of regional history that the mainstream press would probably just as soon like to forget?
If you talk about mainstream history, what we talk about, and a lot of what I talk about in my book, are people who will never be mentioned or things that will never be mentioned, but they made us who we are. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, the city paid a woman, Free Caine, to play the violin to the flowers on the square. That was very cool. I saw her one night around midnight playing her violin. And after she died of cancer, there was a bench dedicated in her honor on the square. That bench is missing now. So Free has been effectively erased from our cultural memory. And nobody seems to know where the bench went. But there's people like Free and the stories like Tri-City or the other the smaller stories I've tried to represent. They make us who we are. We are the sum of our experiences. And we're not just the bankers. We're not just the factory managers. We're not just the mayors or the city council people. Fayetteville is the passion and the flesh and blood of all of the people who live here, and they are not mentioned enough. Do you know that up until the 1960s, most newspapers had labor reporters? Now, do you think the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette or the Northwest Arkansas Times or the Morning News is going to have a labor reporter? I mean, any Walmart development is greeted as manna from heaven. You turn on Channel 29, your hometown news, and it's manna from heaven. They will go crazy over any economic development, despite the fact that we're overbuilding. We're building many little retail outlets that are empty, many apartments that are empty, many houses that are empty. But none of these TV stations and none of these newspapers have labor reporters who talk about the lives of workers.
And I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. Another bit of alternative Ozark history. Who are Tony and Susan Alamo?
Tony and Susan Alamo were the great comedy act of religion in Arkansas. And they pretty much controlled Alma, Arkansas at one point. And they were both violently anti-Catholic. And Susan was the evangelist. And she would preach or scream and exhort the audience. And Tony was her husband who sang. And they were always in trouble with the IRS. And then Susan died. And Tony had her put in a coffin. But he had her put in the living room because Susan was going to rise from the dead. And Tony lived in eternal hope that Susan would rise from the dead until one day I think Susan communicated with Tony and said, well, you need to marry this young girl. And so Susan kind of took a back seat somewhere. And then when Tony got in trouble with the IRS and he went on the lam, he took the coffin with him. Now, there were a lot of rumors that actually Susan's body had been gotten rid of a long time before, and there were negotiable bonds in the coffin, but I think that may be an urban legend. But it's a nice story, though. But Tony's actually in prison right now. But his followers still paper the area with flyers, and they used to put big posters on trash cans talking about the Jews and the Catholics who run the world.
Yeah. Another alternative religious figure to pop up on the regional radar was Timothy Hill, who ran for the mayorhood of Springdale.
Yes.
And, well, aside from wanting to wall the city and arm citizens to the teeth and have homosexuals publicly flogged and teach women their place, he is probably a swell guy. Do you think the mainstream media took Hill seriously? And more importantly, do you think they should have?
I don't think they took him seriously. I think they should have taken him more seriously. Because whether Timothy Hill was dangerous or not, it's people like him who turn out to be the ones who shoot people at abortion clinics or commit acts of violence. And the fact that he was raising his two daughters in this extreme lifestyle, I think, was pretty dangerous. The interesting thing about Timothy was that, he didn't want to spank lesbians. He wanted to spank gay men on the bare bottom. And he said, to prove it doesn't hurt, he said, I'll be the first one to do it. So I'm not. Nice. I think maybe in the interview, Timothy got too comfortable and was revealing a little bit too much of himself. But
well, that's special. Okay. Moving on, a great number of people are moving into this area, and we have. From varying sources, and we have people coming in from other parts of the U.S. We have a lot of immigration currently and so forth. Do you think Fayetteville can realistically handle all the growth? Do we have the infrastructure to cope with all this?
No, we don't have the infrastructure at all. We're hoping we do. We're hoping that the tax dollars will help support this. They used to say, you know what the scariest thing to a Southerner is? It's a Yankee with a U-Haul. And every time we're listed in a magazine as one of the most desirable places in the country to live, we have hordes of people who move to Fayetteville, whether we have jobs or not. And not all of our plants are doing especially well right now. And a lot of the houses are overpriced because they're being built on speculation. And so it's not really market value for the houses and apartments around here because they're basing it on what they hope the income level of the area will be.
Okay. Now I know a lot of the people that have come down are coming in from states where jobs have dried up.
Yeah.
And and they move here in hopes that they hear that we have this fantastic economy, very few people out of work, but it's an issue of the quality of the jobs that we have to give them. Quality of work may not necessarily mean working in a non-unionized factory or shoveling fries at McDonald's.
Or working for Wally World.
Or working for Wally World, and you know how well they pay. at least on the grunt level.
Right.
You know? A question here is, do you think Fayetteville area factories and workplaces will eventually unionize?
No. And I wish they would. Arkansas is a right-to-work state.
Right.
The last serious effort to overthrow the right-to-work status was in the 1970s. And because Arkansas is primarily rural, people on farms in those areas don't see the need for a union, and so they're more susceptible to the anti-union propaganda. And I don't think the unions are effective in promoting their own message either.
No. And now there's a lot of anti-union sentiment, and you can go to some of the factories here in town, and they actually have anti-union, material.
Oh, yes.
And so, people may be inclined to see that sort of thing and believe it. But if there were ever a serious move toward unionizing this area, do you think it could turn out with similar results to some of the Northeast's attempts at unionizing, in which people actually end up getting their heads busted over this?
I could see that. I would like to see Fayetteville adopt a living wage, at least for the city employees, and then it would spread perhaps to other parts of the community. There's no reason to be paying anybody minimum wage, and despite what conservatives or Republicans in Congress will tell you, these are not starter jobs. A lot of people are working at these jobs for 10, 15, 20 years, supporting families, flipping burgers, working at mini-marts, and bringing home dirt poor wages. And they're basically being used as dray animals. And they're not being respected. And I think some change is long overdue. And but it comes through education, and it comes through knowledge. And I think that people should educate themselves. And I don't think they should just watch the local news or read the daily newspapers. I think they should read magazines and and try to get as much information as possible.
If somebody in a plant was of the mind to unionize, thought it was a good idea, etc., what should such a person do? What would be the first steps toward organizing a union in your plant?
Get in touch with the union office so that you're legally protected. But, you can be fired for any reason in Arkansas.
And that's one of them.
Well, yeah, 11 years ago, I spoke out here on public access television. And they were changing the workman's comp laws. And I said, I urge people to contact their elected representatives and ask that organized labor be brought into the process. Well, the next day at work, I found myself written up for violating some company policy that I'd never heard of. And then 6 months later, they gave me a choice of working the crap crew or being a floater, which is maybe I'd work that day, maybe I wouldn't. And I walked in the next day, and my boss's jaw popped open because he didn't expect this. I said, I know more about this operation than you do. I said, I quit. You can't do this to me. This is not right. And I left that. I wasn't married at the time. I wouldn't want to explain to my wife now why I didn't have any money coming in. But I was single at the time. But I lost a job because I talked about unions, and I have known others who have lost their jobs and been I don't want to say they've been blacklisted because you can't prove it, but they had trouble finding employment in the area after they talked about unions in the workplace.
And if one were to attempt unionizing a shop and trouble came because of it, say they lost their job and they had a reasonably sure idea that that's the reason, could that person press a lawsuit?
They possibly could. I doubt.
Is it a winnable case?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think their efforts would be much better spent on educating other people as to the need for unions rather than put their own job in jeopardy. I think that you don't necessarily need to make yourself into a martyr. I think that helping other people learn and to educate people, I think, is maybe one of the best weapons in that fight.
Okay, so it might be better in such a case if a whole group of people got together and rose up simultaneously,
Yes.
rather than just one or two loose cannons. So
I think so. I think if you're organized and you're media savvy, and you're smart and you know how to present your arguments in public forums, I think you have a better chance of educating people. And I think that's something that we have not done very well in the efforts to unionize the state or to change the right to work status.
Okay. Now, you spent years covering Fayetteville politics. Do you ever feel as if you're flogging a dead horse by bringing up issues that most people would prefer to leave untouched?
Sometimes, but I think it's sometimes I think there are people who appreciate the fact that issues are talked about. Some people would prefer that you stay away from gay, and certainly when I was with the Ozark Gazette and with Grapevine, there were people who would prefer that we would stay away from gay issues. Stay away. I mean, how many papers around here talk about workers' rights or labor issues? You know, nobody does that. And to reiterate a point I made a few minutes ago, it's environmental issues. Conversely, seem to be it's more acceptable to talk about environmental issues than it is to talk about human sexuality or labor issues or human rights issues.
Well, it seems almost easier in this area to talk about sexuality than labor issues.
Yes, but even that's you're on thin ice, you know. Especially if you want to protect your job, because you can be fired for being gay. You know, you can be fired for wearing the wrong hat.
Okay. Have you ever received any threats or serious negative responses to your journalistic efforts?
Well, there was when I lost my job in '93 when I was put in a position where I was forced to quit. That was pretty serious. Nobody's ever threatened me physically. When I ran with the wrong crowd in the '80s, and I used to drink a lot and ran with rough people, I got threatened on a regular basis, but that wasn't over politics. That was just over stupid stuff. But no, I've never been threatened physically over anything I've written.
Well, that's good. Your book stops at the year 2002. What are the hot issues in the area now?
I think they're the same thing. I think things go in a circle, Shannon, and a lot of times the people who bring issues to the fore are sort of unpleasant. They're rough-hewn. They're angry people. They're people with no social skills. And they're the ones who fight, and they're the ones who bring other people's attention to things. And then you get more of the mainstream, the working class, more of the mainstream people. And then after you've won some of the major issues, things start to quieten down. And then people who are kind of too chicken to come out in the first place, they kind of take over the movements. And then, you know, it becomes like a social club. And then you start losing things. And because they're not vigilant, and they become easily fooled, easily conned, and they become part of the in crowd. And then you sometimes find the fights starting all over again. So the same fights, the environmental fights, the labor fights, the sexual battles, these are going to continue well into the 21st century.
So if you take something that was fairly recent, say the smoking ordinance, and the outcry about that, really it's all part of a continuum of the same set of issues. It's different issues, different topics, but it's the same kind of behavioral patterns that work behind
Yes, it is. And so you really have to be vigilant all the time. I don't think you can ever rest. I think people have to be informed. People have to read. People have to watch the news. They have to have a BS factor, too. And you go down to Radio Shack and you buy a BS detector and you attach it to your cable box. But you have to be able to recognize trends in the news that are supportive of like certain Chamber of Commerce projects, certain development projects, and you have to recognize what's not being covered. And I think a lot of people need to be educated on how to see what's not being covered, that it will affect them.
So that would be one of the primary roles of alternative journalism, is the coverage of things that would, under normal circumstances, be swept under the rug.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which is one of the things we do here in public access, too. Though, I mean, it's conservative as well as liberal down here in public access. But I love the world of alternative journalism, alternative newspapers. And we did get to cover a lot of things that other people simply did not want to cover. We covered a lot of things before other people covered them. We broke a lot of stories that mainstream papers broke weeks or months after we did.
Okay. Now, in some of your editorials and articles, you've addressed various things that have kind of gone wrong regionally. But looking at the other side of the coin, what's right about Fayetteville? And what makes this area such a unique and desirable place in which to live?
I think Fayetteville's still pretty free and open, and I think these cameras in the room are one of the things that makes Fayetteville so unique, because I think the other communities in our area are terrified of public access and are terrified of a citizenry. So, in many cities, they don't even have a public comment section in their city council or their county meetings. So the fact that we have a chance for people to speak out is very important. And Fayetteville's mocked for this in other parts of the state. Rogers, Bentonville, other parts of the state. Fayetteville is made fun of because we have citizens who are ready to sue, we're ready to speak up, we're ready to protest at the drop of a hat. But that's one of the strengths of Fayetteville. And I'd rather live in a town like Fayetteville where people maybe are combative sometimes than a city where people are afraid to speak up or don't know how to speak up. So at least in Fayetteville, we've given people the tools to stand up for themselves.
Okay. Well, we've been talking with Richard S. Drake, and he's the author of Ozark Mosaic, Adventures in Arkansas Alternative Journalism. And once again, I really want to thank you for being on this show.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay. For the Caine Interviews, I'm Shannon Caine. Thanks for watching.